all get to stand up, and by request, we are going to do the Macarena. No, just kidding, just kidding. So thank you so much to Dr. Cross and to Dr. Chang for a really provoking session. So we just wanted to give you an opportunity to stand up, stretch, move around a little bit, get the blood flowing. But we also wanted to give you an opportunity to think about all of the very thought-provoking and insightful lessons, stories, best practices that you've heard this morning. And so we have posed 2 questions for you with the idea that we wanted to start thinking about inspiration in terms of engineering and hearing all the inspiring talks today. So for what societal challenges has engineering research been most transformational, in your opinion? And what opportunities for social innovation and impact has engineering research missed up until now? What have you found to be frustrating? Or what solutions have failed? Or what projects have not achieved the results that you intended? So you'll see that there are note cards at each of your, there are white note cards in the middle of each of your tables. If you would write down a quick response to each of these questions, maybe one question on the front, one on the back, discuss it with your table mates, and then we'll have some bowls up here, and you can, walk up to the front of the room, get some movement, and we'll collect your responses. And we have just about 10 minutes for this activity. So if you haven't yet brought up your activity note cards, please bring them to the front of the room. All right, everyone, we are now moving into the panel portion of the session. If you'd please take your seats. So before I introduce our 2 panelists, I just wanted to give another round of applause for Dr. Chang and Dr. Cross. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Dr. James Moore. Dr. Moore is the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at The Ohio State University. He also serves in many other capacities, such as the Executive Director of the Todd Anthony Bell National Resource Center on the African American Male. Prior to that, he served as a rotating program director for broadening participation in engineering in the NSF's Engineering Directorate. Our panel also includes Eleonore Pauwels, a research fellow on emerging cyber technologies at the United Nations University. Eleonore previously held the position of Director of Anticipatory Intelligence Lab with the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is also a formal official of the European Commission's Directorate on Science, Economy, and Society. So thank you both very much for being here with us today. And Dr. Moore, I will turn the floor over to you for your remarks to either of our speakers or any wisdom or insights you have for the audience about social innovation and impact. So, thank you.
Good morning. All right. I'm delighted to be here. This is such a momentous occasion and a great timing to be in a room with so many bright individuals. And, part of my remarks, I like to focus on diversity and inclusion and its importance in integration in all facets of the ERCs, the research, workforce development, diversity and inclusion, creating a culture of inclusion, as well as innovative ecosystem. And during my time at the National Science Foundation, I found that there's nothing unique in the agency that I discovered when I did reviews of different projects, but I often see it even within my own institution. When we think about diversity and inclusion, it seems to be an outlier rather than being at the center, at the core of what we do, and how do we integrate it in all of those facets. You know, what's really important to note is that in order for us to prosper and flourish in a rapidly growing, diverse society, it's important that our nation maximize all its resources, both human and financial. And too often when we think about the landscape across America, we kind of see diversity as a charitable activity versus at the core of our advancement as a nation. When you look at the demographic swing across the nation, our country is really becoming more global. The world has always been comprised of communities of color, but increasingly from a macro level, we're seeing it in our country. But unfortunately, I think prophetically, when you go back and think about a recent past social science report by the Hudson Institute in 1983, this report prophetically highlighted the state of America and where we will be in terms of the workforce. It says the new worker will be comprised of women, ethnic minorities, and immigrants. And it's nothing by that we want to discriminate from other groups. It's just basically what has happened as we think about demographic changes. Communities that used to have babies at a very high rate are no longer having babies at the same rate, and these other communities are having babies at a very high rate. But when you look at the demographics across America, among communities of color, oftentimes they are located in parts of the country where they're not always afforded access to all the wonderful resources as well as educational opportunities that oftentimes are available to other groups. So in order for us, to think about, I know the National Science Foundation has put many resources in broadening participation, nearly $1 billion. I think it's a little over $800 million. But many of these activities haven't been closely connected in a way where we can really truly broadening in participation. What is seminal and what's quite important, I didn't believe this until I actually worked at the National Science Foundation. They certainly brainwashed me and said, when you think about STEM, it's a big E in STEM and all the other letters are lowercase. And engineering it's an economic stimulus for not only for advancement of communities, but to improve the quality of life for so many individuals. Too many of our young people, when I talk about across the nation where much of our diversity resides, and particularly, Robert Johnson just came to Ohio State, and he's a renowned demographer at the University of North Carolina, and one of his, part of his talk was that the South will rise again. And I'm like, well, what is he talking about, right? And he's basically saying when you look in the southern part of the state, you see increasingly people who these communities that migrated in the Midwest and the Northeast, their populations are declining quite rapidly in the West and the southeastern part of the country, where we see dense populations of underrepresented communities. But unfortunately, when you follow those trails, you see major pockets of economic disparity. And we know that within these communities, I know NSF, within the ERCs, we work aggressively to provide outreach to the K-12 context. But I would say in our reports, we need to be a little bit more deliberate about the schools that we do begin to provide outreach and extend opportunities, because we know that all AP is not created equally. All IB is not created equally. There's disparities all across the educational pipeline. And what I mean by that, I think we should be thinking about when we're reaching out in our work and to integrate diversity and inclusion across the enterprise within the research construct, even within when we think about the ecosystem, because there's an ecosystem, broadly speaking, when we think about diversity and inclusion. And too often, some of these communities are not a part of this ecosystem. And even when I look at and review proposals, oftentimes even the people who we select to engage, even the social scientists that my colleague highlighted initially, they not always at the center when the whole project was initially developed. They usually come in at the tail end, which creates the kind of disjointedness that impacts the project when we begin to look at the diversity, the workforce, and the other elements. And usually the test beds tend to be strong, but let me just say to each and every one of them, we'll never solve the broadening participation challenge unless we focus on it. And one thing we know about in this country, when we focus on things, we begin to solve some of the mysteries behind it. Like when Russia launched the Sputnik, you know, our country tried numerous times and we failed. And as a result, because Russia, it's quite surprising today that now Russia has become my best friend. I'm sure my grandparents are rolling over in their graves, but quite often, that's another sidebar. But what is quite interesting, we made it a goal, and educational improvement was not a U.S. Department of Education endeavor. It became a U.S. Department of Defense endeavor. They got engaged in the STEM journey. What I also want to highlight in the broadening participation, when I was talking about, it's important that we think about specific schools, not just going to the easy schools where we know that they have access to chemistry and they have laboratories. And usually we're talking about the private and some of the suburban schools where my kids go, but certainly not some of the schools where my cousins go to, where they may not have access to the same opportunities, but many of them have the same aspirations. But the aspirations are disrupted because of access to opportunities. The ERCs are incubators for change, incubators for opportunities, not only all the reservoir resources that come along with them. And so not on what I mean by that, they're rural. I grew up in a rural area, and rural has become a foreign concept, even though I built a career around urban education. These are two areas that are really crucial that we begin to think about when we do our outreach and we extend opportunities. I'm proud to say that when I was at NSF, I got to work with Mary, and we did some pilot things where how we could get some of these Title I schools in urban and rural communities access to research opportunities very early. Not only that, when we think about diversity, you know, baseball players hit the ball where no one is, but if you want diversity, you have to go where they are. And what I mean by that is we need to think about community colleges. What is the role of community colleges in our efforts? Sometimes not having the capacity, but there's a workforce. And much of the mission and the foundation of community colleges are driven by the workforce development framework. The other things are, you know, when we're thinking about it, I'm very excited. I understand that NSF just funded AP workshop to create an engineering AP course. Too often students opt out or foreclose on engineering because it's quite foreign unless you come from families and communities where you're readily exposed to it. But some of them, you think just instantly because you've been exposed to STEM that you instantly know what engineering is. You know, I learned really quickly during my time at NSF that I thought I knew a lot about engineering, but I learned that I just knew just a little surface level. But out of this, creating the AP courses, is that a place that we can think about how we can glean and prime the pump to develop new talent, individuals, domestic groups that traditionally do not have access. That's going to be quite exciting because you hear right now, it's a whole entire initiative within the agency that focuses on computer science for all. I'm hopeful that we'll have an engineering for all, that with young people, women, underrepresented groups, communities from the Delta, from the Black Belt of Alabama, or even from Appalachia in Ohio and Virginia, et cetera. The other thing is another untapped opportunity for us to think about when we're talking about increasing and sustaining participation within the enterprise is how do we even tap into those students who already demonstrated high capability in the STEM areas. There are over 12,000 jobs categorized by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And most of our young people, they probably couldn't even name 100 different occupations that are available to them. As I said, it's hard to be interested in something if you've never been exposed to it. A major component, regardless of the enterprise that you pursue academically, it's important that you become interested. When you're interested, you become curious. The second thing is preparation. It's important that we ensure that all groups are given the necessary preparation. In preparation, you can go to the right school and still not necessarily be prepared to the level that we want, because increasingly when I talk to our professors, they always say these students are just not prepared like they used to. It doesn't matter what school they go to. I hear that they're not prepared. So preparation is a critical element. The other people, experiences, quality, meaningful experiences that our students from K to grade that they have access to. I mean, quality experiences. Experiences that are indicative of the engineering trajectory that they may have for themselves. The other piece are connections. It's important that students and individuals across the enterprise, K to grade, at every juncture, because we're losing individuals at every juncture of the educational pipeline, is connections to individuals. We know from social science standpoint, academic achievement is highly correlated with the relationship that the individual has with his or her professor. When individuals are not afforded those kind of opportunities, oftentimes it hampers their educational trajectory or what the possibilities may be. The last but not least, opportunities, and I think the ERCs represent the ultimate opportunity for engineering. I know some of you all are probably saying that, wow, the ERCs is really about research, but if you really study the origins of the National Science Foundation, it wasn't founded initially as a research enterprise. It was founded for a workforce development enterprise. And it's important that we not lose that piece of the ERCs. And think about it when I think my colleague earlier talked about systems thinking. You have to be a systems thinker and to embrace convergence. It's important that we have a variety of different individuals. One of the main thrusts within the agency is probably the new darling of the agency is the NSF Includes. And the social innovation framework that they use is a collective impact. Think about that not from just only a diversity standpoint. Think about it from thinking about all those different thrusts that I highlighted that could be infused to have the collective impact, not only for your particular area where you reside, but to have a rippling effect across the United States. Thank you. I look forward to engaging you.
So good morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here in such a good company to talk about converging technologies and its broad societal impact. So I want to start with two stories that I think epitomize very well why we are meeting today. And the first one is about a simple piece of wood or metal, a bench. So you see them on the slides. And I recently moved to New York, a city which doesn't leave much time or space for rest. But still, the other day, I wanted to lay down for a few minutes. And I discovered I couldn't because of how the bench had been designed. And if you look around the world, you see the same phenomenon in different countries. So single occupancy bench in Sweden, cage benches in France, I'm not proud of it. And then this one, the pay-as-you-sit bench, where you literally have to pay to be able to sit down. So these different designs are not targeting a relatively well-off traveler like me, but they are shaped this way to prevent homeless people from invading public space. So the main design consideration is about optimizing public order rather than providing a space to those who have very few left. And this is an example of what I call discrimination in design. And such discrimination does not only hide within artifacts, but also in clinical or research trials. So you have the same phenomenon at play when a research team studying predictive factors of criminal behaviors focuses on traces of impulsivity in brain scans. So not on issues of access to education, jobs, and secure living, but impulsivity. Too bad we didn't search for impulsivity on Wall Street before the financial crisis. But this lack of reflexivity of self-criticism can lead to discrimination into the design of a medical trial. Think of optimizing certain genetic functions when using gene editing, CRISPR. So for example, optimizing for muscle mass in dogs, as it has been done, or the design of certain type of algorithm, if you think of artificial intelligence. So the public bench can become very easily the AI or the biolab bench. And recently I've been thinking about what in artificial intelligence would be the equivalent of the pay-as-you-sit bench. And I think the answer is what Joy, the poet of code, she's on this slide. So Joy, the poet of code at MIT, she calls it the coded gaze. So when an algorithm equipped with facial recognition fails to recognize women and people of colors. Which leads to another issue I'm deeply involved with, and which should be part of the teaching of the next generation of engineers, the inequality about who gets to anticipate the design, the role, and the impact of an emerging technology. And this question is crucial in another field I have studied, research on gene drives, which are essentially self-replicating genetic programs. So to eradicate malaria, gene drives are designed in high-security biolabs in the West, while we actually fear they could produce new invasive species in the far-reaching ecosystems where they will be released. So the same way in artificial intelligence, we may need to ask ourselves, how can our algorithmic inventions be designed and governed so that they meet the ethical needs of a globalizing world? And how can we foster this equality in anticipation? So I use these stories as a detour and a bridge to talk about essentially the elephant in the room, discrimination in design, which is often experienced by vulnerable population. So not the positive, but the negative societal impact that may come with different forms of engineering, bio, architecture, the benches, or artificial intelligence. And this detour also gives you a sense of how I experience convergence research. So my interest focuses on the powerful merger of our physical, digital, and biological lives, and more precisely, the enabling intersection between AI and genomics, technologies which have emerging properties, unintended consequences, and which deeply question our collective well-being. And so I'm convinced that these technologies will increasingly raise for engineers similar ethical issues in design that I would sum up in a long question. How to identify, assess, and mitigate the unknowns, the biases, and the failures of our technical systems early on, upstream in the design process, so that we can iterate and build for resilience and safe behaviors next time. So in brief, how to imagine and engineer together for positive societal impact. Next, I want to share with you a few cases of governance anomalies in converging technologies, in particular AI and genomics, to show how engineers will be increasingly challenged on ethical and governance issues. And these few cases of modern AI and biosecurity are striking examples of what is called permissionless innovation, or misuse innovation, in the sense that the action of a few tech actors, traditional experts, sometimes hackers, are increasingly challenging implicit safety practices and compromising the security of larger groups in society. So these cases are salient examples of how to deal with a complex, decentralized technology whose design exhibits potential uncertainties and vulnerabilities that could lead to significant societal risk. And I call them governance anomalies because they usually prompt new regulation. So the first scenario is about who, among private and state actors can control and amplify the new alliance between bio and cyber power. So AI systems are increasingly equipped with biosensors and facial recognition. They already analyze our biometrics or vital signs. Some analyze our emotions and behaviors. And so in the near future, AI will watch us. We'll go from the predictive power of one algorithm to the next. And we may give up to AI systems unique access to our bodies, our genomes, our minds, and create possibilities for new forms of social and biocontrol. And so I call this set of networks the Internet of Bodies. You could call it pervasive algorithmic governance. A few concrete examples. So for example, facial recognition is used for intelligence, public surveillance, and predictive policing already in the US and in China. Emotion analysis is used in the courtroom to detect remorse in deposition video, on social media to nudge behaviors, and could be misused, some companies are working on this, could be misused during job interviews as a stress test, so as an emotion detector, literally. AI engineers already recognize that this new form of intrusive computing into our personal life has wide implications for self-determination and for privacy, so for our collective well-being. The second anomaly might have an even broader impact as it pertains to truth, identity, and trust. We call it deepfake, so the manipulation of sound, images, or video to impersonate someone. Think of a destructive variation of the Turing test, an imitation designed to deceive, not to emulate. Not to emulate, to deceive. In the lab, deep learning can now read lips and reproduce speech accurately, meaning your voice, your behavior, and the meaning of your words. If we release this technique into the wild, it will diffuse rapidly and globally by publications, open source, or hacking, and then we don't know who and what to trust. Again, a few concrete examples. You could have, on the eve of an election, deepfake videos could feature public officials taking bribes, meeting with spies or criminals, or leaking intelligence documents. Soldiers could be shown murdering innocent civilians in war zone. A fake video might depict safety officials announcing a missile strike on LA or an emerging pandemic in New York. So deepfakes will have powerful long-term systemic implications for national security and for the very fabric of our democracy. Another controversial scenario in genomics this time is the publication of two peer-reviewed papers that discussed how to convert a deadly strain of influenza in birds, H5N1, to one that could spread among mammals. And for the academic team of bioengineers, the main goal was to analyze the genetic mechanism by which a virus could become able to target our immune system. And therefore, it was a valuable piece of research in the arsenal of medical countermeasures. For biosecurity, for the biosecurity communities, this experiment breached essential security rules by publishing in the open two scientific papers about what is considered a dual-use research of concern. And so reaction from lawmakers were prompt, with a moratorium on H5N1 research for a year and a wider moratorium on gain-of-function research. So the last anomaly is not only about access to knowledge, but access to specific genetic codes, quite similar to algorithms, and access to automated cloud labs that allow researchers to conduct experiments from their laptop outside of a traditional university. And indeed, this is how recently biologists at a private company were able to avoid the guard of the biosecurity community and synthesize from scratch a virus, horsepox, very close to the deadly smallpox, and then publish the results. And today there are at least two avenues on how to make a common virus or toxin more infectious using automated biolabs, so cloud labs, and biocomputation software. And these two avenues are mainly using online tools. They are avoiding traditional biosecurity checks, and they are available to anyone with the know-how beyond the academic community. And so in this case, the tension between openness and secrecy focused essentially on access to data, the DNA sequences, and access to software, a cloud lab, that could reproduce and enhance a specific bioagent. So all these governance anomalies are essentially complex situations that engineers already face at the intersection of AI, genomics, and biodata, and where it is increasingly difficult to anticipate and measure how to align converging technologies with the public interest. So these anomalies show the need for a strategic discussion about how we train the next generation of engineers. We'll increasingly need to understand the complex implications of converging technologies. And we need to talk to them about when and how to foster or limit access to sensitive information and practices, what is now called dual-use research of concern. And we may need to redefine that concept in the era of AI and genomics. So should we limit access to training data that are biased to source code, explicit and tacit knowledge? How do we give access to safety techniques and networks of expertise? Next, I wanted to share with you a policy diagnosis about the most important factors that complexify the task of engineers and challenge the potential for societal impact. So first, converging technologies such as AI and genomics are inherently dual use. We design algorithms with a specific set of optimizing functions that can be used to both empower or control and manipulate populations. And too often, the designs of AI systems tend to reflect the priorities and preferences of those who have the knowledge and power to shape the AI revolution. So one of the main democratic concerns in governing a converging technology like AI becomes whether we'll be controlled by powerful technical systems whose evolutive design we did not fully understand and whose ramifications we did not anticipate. The same emerging properties or evolutive design is characteristic of genetic systems, such as gene drives. And so this could lead to augment the burden of risk for those who are already vulnerable, as I mentioned in the story, the African population suffering from malaria. The second issue is the atomized responsibility. This notion, the fact that responsibility is being increasingly atomized and distributed in the misuse of powerful technologies. And this is obvious with a technology like AI, but increasingly in the case of biology and genomics, you see that the technology is becoming decentralized, digitalized. And so we need to think about those new systems. For instance, the ubiquitous access to data and source code means that the responsibility for the misuse of AI is somehow distributed among designers, regulators, users, and hackers. How do we think about this? Most engineers in the civilian industry are becoming aware that beyond the lab in the wild, in the hands, or let's say in the codes of hackers and malicious actors, part of the research is highly sensitive and should be labeled dual-use research of concern. Essentially, the tension they face are between commitment to transparency and reproducibility versus secrecy and containment. So there is an expectation, for example, that a lab like DeepMind or Google should publish their algorithms. They should publish most of their research. And at the same time, there is this tension with how do we protect the collective body? How do we protect for collective security? So can algorithms and data be contained? We can already, with difficulty, containing genetic systems and genetic code. Can we do it for algorithms? The question is probably something we have to think with engineers. This tension is also magnified by another phenomenon, what I call the permissionless innovation. So for example, in the case of AI, we have no solid clinical trials or no trials. We have no tech assessment. Policy expertise is lagging behind, and we don't have liability or legal frameworks that can comprehend this new technology. We see the same ethos of permissionless innovation invading genomics and biology, where we see the same kind of race towards experimenting with new technologies like germline editing or gene editing. Which leads me to the final parameter that challenges societal impact, the role of the private sector, which plays a crucial role in genomics, but even more in AI. So advances in AI are driven by private tech platforms. It's Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, Google, DeepMind. that have the cloud and the computing power to commodify and control our data. They're also the main strategic actors that have expressed ambition to develop superintelligence, to solving intelligence. Google is actively researching how to develop self-learning systems able to achieve emotion analysis, abstract reasoning, and decision-making. And China has established a national deep learning lab under Baidu's leadership to conduct research in superintelligence. So these private labs are increasingly the place to go for engineers. Those labs, a lab like DeepMind, for example, in London, hire 20 engineers a week. So that's pretty high. The salaries are also very compelling, so it's a successful engineering story. So to sum up these thoughts around the policy challenges, I think we are facing at least two asymmetries between the world of tech and the real world. The disconnect between people who develop technologies and the communities who use them. So technology is not value neutral, and it needs to be built and shaped by a diversity of community. That's how we avoid discrimination in design. And for example, I've been working for a few years with someone who develops AI from the street in Shenzhen at an open innovation lab. And the question we keep asking is, what if our cities could be globally connected, yet locally inventive and inspired by a diversity of knowledge and vision? And second, we need to discuss how to build a social license for converging technologies, so including new incentive structures to encourage state and private actors to align the development and the deployment of converging technologies with the public interest. And here, my intimate conviction is that we need to better understand the nature and scope of those policy challenges we are facing and raised by converging technologies. And so we need to achieve a form of inclusive foresight, but it has to be much more inclusive than what we designed in the past. So mapping and anticipating the unknown implications of a powerful set of dual-use technologies, and doing so with a diversity of knowledge and life experiences. And that's what I call equality in anticipation. I think I will end here. That kind of reinforces your message.
Thank you so much to our panel. We are now going to open the floor for questions for Eleonore and Dr. Moore and Dr. Chang and Dr. Cross.
Specifically for Dr. Moore.
No, France.
But this question is really for you. I wonder, within the context of this ERC, you felt that it's best to think about inclusiveness always broadly, or to say, we're going to pick one underrepresented group and focus on that and try to learn our lessons from that and then see how that broadens out and can address other groups. Am I making my question kind of clear?
Yes. That's a good question. And you know, using the concept of a test bed, oftentimes we test different things before we scale. But I think it's important that we use strategy and we have a model that we use to what are the end goals? Not just to do it arbitrary, but you have a systematic approach to how you want to advance the project. Now, the paradox of inclusion, sometimes we are exclusive to be inclusive. And that's oftentimes very problematic. I think how I would frame it is in social science, we talk about experimental designs, and some people struggle with one group getting the treatment and another group not getting the treatment, because the treatment could be beneficiary. And what some social scientists, social and behavioral scientists do is have a delayed treatment. And so the strategy is, it could make sense depending on where you are, and it could be context-based, based on where you are located around the country. But I won't say it's an either or, but I think it's important to think through all those things, because a major thrust is creating a culture of inclusion. And the paradox of it is you think you might be doing something for one group, and oftentimes the other groups may think you're being exclusive.
Other questions? Margaret?
Yes, I thought it would be interesting to hear Dr. Chang and Dr. Cross discuss perhaps using the design process, and in your case, the multi-scale, how to approach dealing with the issues that were raised by Dr. Moore and Dr. Pauwels, the issue of how to think through and avoid unintended consequences, how to think about not excluding particular groups that may benefit, et cetera.
There, okay. I'm sure there's a lot of expertise around this room that we could all kind of share in the subject. I'll share one example, and there's no one solution. If there were, right, we wouldn't have these challenges that we have. But one of the things that's kind of cool is when you're not overtly teaching about diversity or inclusion, but the sort of transformation understanding impact is profound. And so, like, similar to the class that Jenny described, where she had students designing for the local community in different projects, we had a class, it was a public health class, where students were helping this community that's not too far from here, Temple Hills in Prince George's County. It's got high violence, low income, primarily African American and Hispanic communities. And through some very generous contributions, there's going to be a free community health clinic put there. And so this class had students going out and doing observation interviews. They literally took a bus down to Temple Hills and spent the entire day there, walking into the local grocer, into the restaurant, into the barber shop, and just talking to people who work there, live there, to learn a little bit about what it's like to be there, with the ultimate goal of like what should be in this community health center. And just the reflections from a lot of the students, some of whom saying, I grew up in Prince George's County and I just thought where I lived was representative of Prince George's County, but I had no idea that they live in, the entire healthcare to them is, just little things like, I talked to a high school student who said that her grandmother can't get health care because she can't speak English, so unless her granddaughter skips school to take her grandmother to the doctor, the grandmother won't get health care. And so that just kind of, that wasn't the intent of the class, but that was like sort of self-learning, learning by doing, and I don't know, so I'll just stop there.
I would just add to that I don't think that diversity and inclusion is about picking a group of underrepresented folks and making a plan to deal with them. I think the strategy is what Dr. Moore said, which is you need to have a systematic process for engaging people and engaging a larger group than we might typically have experienced, and that's what's required for transdisciplinarity and for convergent research. So I'll just give another quick example. The courses I teach on community development and applied social change, I involve all of my students for a whole semester in a research project for an agency. And so one of the ones we were doing was creating a special populations communication plan for the local county health department, and she had identified who she thought were the 5 most at-risk populations. But when I do that work, I always tell my community partners that this is a collaboration and that every partner brings equal knowledge and valuable knowledge to the process. So I work with the partners before the semester begins to identify their questions that are doable in the scope for my students, and then the first day of class they come and present their questions to the class. And then the students must develop a research plan to answer them. But I always tell the students that they are going to alter the questions because they know things that the community partner doesn't know. So in this case, the things that got modified from the original plan were that the students said, you've left off a really important vulnerable population in Fort Collins, which is tourists. Some of our big risks happen during the summer, and that's when we have tens of thousands of extra people here, and they don't understand wildfire, they don't understand flash floods, they don't know their own risks from weather, and so that's a vulnerable population that we need to think about. So we built a whole new group around that idea. We had a group that was focusing on aging, and my students said, this is for the whole county, right? You know that the county of Fort Collins is like the size of Rhode Island or something ridiculously huge. And they're like, I don't think the solution for communicating with the elderly in Fort Collins is the same as communicating with the elderly in the rural groups. So that group that was focused on elderly immediately split into two groups and said, we assume that the knowledge networks and the networks of information flow in the urban space are different than in the rural. So they went out to the rural parts of the community and discovered things. The students who were studying the Latino population, who's the greatest minority group in our town, they went to talk to them, and they were hanging out and talking and observing. And all the other projects had a little bit more predictable outcomes, but this group said, you know, the way to reach this community is to put a kiosk in the local Mexican stores. And the county health department had never thought about having an informational kiosk, but the owners of those stores said, we would love to have it. We would love to have a kiosk that has your information and flyers, as well as your communications when there's a current health risk, like, you know, air contamination from wildfires or something. So what I would say is that I actually give a talk on ethics and diversity in community-based research, and what I find is that every project is enhanced and improved by the knowledge and the intentional inclusion from the very beginning of the specialized knowledge that every group of my students bring. And every one of my group, every class of my students has a whole variety of diversity and knowledge in it that I would never think of, and our research projects are always improved by asking them to shift and think about new solutions and new questions that the original proposal didn't begin with. So I think that the answer is this intentional process, which Moore was talking about, and I think that my example is an example, a tangible example of that. What is that? Consistent process of integration of knowledge from diverse stakeholders.
Any other questions? So I would like to close this session by asking our panel to please leave our audience with some words of wisdom or some final thoughts for anyone feeling a little overwhelmed about how to work across multiple levels of social systems, how to engage underrepresented groups and all the social, economic injustice surrounding that, how to forecast unintended consequences of science and technology, all while having the largest impact and potentially being profitable and attractive to funders. While also putting in a damn good science proposal.
Okay, I'll go first. I was always that kid in class who had their hand up before the question was even asked. So I think the simple but maybe not simple answer is to bring in the most diverse set of stakeholders as early as you possibly can and have them engaged in workshops where they're thinking together about possibilities and ideas and leaving room for that divergent thought about what are all of the things that we could do, because a bunch of crazy ideas. I talk to facilitators who do this for a living, who facilitate integrative design and who facilitate community deliberation. And the people who do this well say that you know you haven't done enough divergence until you've heard some really crazy and really crappy ideas. And you haven't gotten there until people are so uncomfortable with the uncertainty. Until you've gotten there, you're not ready to facilitate the process of people narrowing those ideas down onto the one really best, most innovative one. So I encourage you to think about the opportunities for bringing in third-party facilitators and bringing in the most diverse group of people for your earliest thinking about what could your ERC be about and address.
I'll throw something out. I mean, I guess, so there are always lots and lots of really smart people with great proposals, and the competition is really tough, and we all know that. And so, I mean, just something to think about. Something that might help set you apart is if you actually are very forthcoming in what you don't know, and that's why we're bringing in this particular team member from this different area of expertise or culture or whatever. I mean, I personally, that's what I look for. I tell my students that, you know, we are all very smart. I want to hear your questions. So here's we went and talked to this group, and this is what we found really fascinating, and that's the angle we want to take. We want to know more about that. So just as a way of differentiating, just like the example I gave with talking with the Gates Foundation, talk to your program officers, find out what their questions are. You don't have to have the answer for it, but have a plan for, like, here's who we're going to talk to, or who we're going to work with, or who we're going to bring on the team to address those questions. Those are ways that you maybe can help. I mean, you've already separated yourselves from a large pack, but just to continue to make that progress.
I'll try not to say some of the same things, but I would say that there are immense opportunities for funding beyond the National Science Foundation. Primarily, it's important for everyone to know that diversity and inclusion is not only for underrepresented groups. It's for everyone to create an inclusion of a culture of inclusion. Primarily when people feel connected and engaged and that their ideas are being accepted, because you won't be forthcoming if you hadn't created a context for that. So those crazy ideas won't emerge if you look at somebody like they're crazy. But oftentimes it's the kind of innovation. If you think about this new generation, and when we watch 60 Minutes and we see all the crazy things that are going on at Google, you know, they don't even dress up like, you know, the baby boomers and Generation X like me, and it's a totally different culture, and they do things much differently. I think sometimes it's putting yourself in a space that you're a student and you're a sponge. For example, you know, we have one of the largest diversity scholarships in America at our university, and we changed it, not about what you look like, but what are you doing to make the world better? And that's a different kind of spin. It's not exclusion, because everybody can contribute to that. And what I'm saying, when I have a $2.5 million proposal that I just submitted, like literally yesterday. And the whole gist of it, when these companies are trying to recruit my underrepresented students, I said, let me tell you about the students who are not underrepresented. We got 6,000 applications, and we're only going to award about 400 students. And my students who don't come from those communities, you don't have to train them to do this. This is who they are, and this is a part of their DNA. When you create a culture of inclusion, like what I would always say before the RFP come out, I would always say, create work groups now. And the work groups should focus on all these different kinds of things, because convergence is important. And perhaps you put people in subgroups, but they come together, and then they really terrorize the topics from the various perspectives. Because to be honest with you, most of the proposals got strong test beds. It's these other areas that they're not properly integrated from my perspective, and being on review teams that will impact your projects in a profound way when they go through the review panels. So I would say, encourage you not to take this lightly, not just to delegate it to a diversity person, is to find out and think about it critically and analytically, how we are integrating all of these things. And last but not least, even though we have our own research test bed, but I think diversity and inclusion, because all the resources that we put into that area you should have a research area for all of those different test bed pillars. I close on that.
And I would just reuse the story of Joy, you know, with the decoded gaze. So she's lucky enough to be a student at MIT, but she actually undertook the research herself to show why facial recognition programs were actually not working well and how they were discriminatory. So she did, you know, extensive data research. She tried the design, and then she went back to IBM to actually all the promoters of those software, and was able to make them change the system and to some extent improve it. And she will keep doing it. Can we give that opportunity to other, you know, other communities? So can we create that safe space for a form of what I kind of describe as inclusive foresight. So, foster capacity to imagine and design the future we want, the diverse future we want, and anticipate what can be empowering and what can be discriminatory. And I think we would gain from giving that opportunity and that learning much, much earlier on and upstream in the process.
Thank you all once again. And I believe that before we